Hey everyone, welcome and thank you for joining me for another video. Today we're going to talk about Rory and Dean's relationship from the Gilmore Girls. This is a continuation of the series that I have been working on, discussing some of the relationships in the Gilmore Girls. I'll link the playlist below, but I've already done Richard and Emily and Lorelai and Luke if you haven't seen those yet. And now we're moving on to Rory's relationships. And yes, I will be doing Rory and Jess and Rory and Logan in future videos, so make sure that you're subscribed if you don't want to miss those. Now, Rory and Dean's relationship, I thought at first was going to be really boring. Like, I thought it was going to have to be the relationship that I kind of get over before we get to the more interesting, let's say, relationships that we see with Rory and Jess or Rory and Logan. But upon further reflection and rewatching some of the older series, I actually found that I had a lot to talk about with Rory and Dean's relationship that I maybe hadn't picked up on originally. So hopefully you will also get a little bit more insight into some of these dynamics that I think were hidden below the sort of veneer of Rory and Dean, the teen romance, good guy, perfect couple sort of thing. But before we get into all of that, if you're new here, my name is Tanya and I am a family lawyer and mediator, and on this channel I like to dive into relationships, everything from dating to divorce. So if that sounds like something that you would like to see more of, you know what to do. So without further ado, let's just jump right into the topic at hand. Now, I'm going to break this up into Rory and Dean, the early years, and then, of course, Rory and Dean, the reunion, reconnection, the affair, or let's just say Rory and Dean 2.0. But first, we need to understand a few things about Rory as a character. So Rory is Lorelai's daughter and her only child. Lorelai had Rory when she was 16 years old, and she ran off from her parents' house and made a new life for herself as a single mother, a single teen mother actually, working at the Independence Inn as a maid and eventually working her way up to managing the inn, which is where we meet them at the beginning of the series. So the things to understand about Rory are, number one, she is a people pleaser. And this has a lot to do with her upbringing, because as much as Lorelai is portrayed as a fun and quirky sort of character and a mother, like a cool mom, understand that this dynamic probably led to a certain amount of parentification when it comes to Rory. Now, I'm not going to get into too much detail about that here. I can do another video about it if you want. For the purposes of this video, what you need to understand is that Lorelai was a teen mom, and in some ways, the trauma of having gotten pregnant and having run off from home has in a way stunted her maturity and her development emotionally, which is why she can come off so fun and cool and almost like another teenager in the series. But as a child, when your mom is emotionally immature, what often happens is that the child will react in a way where they feel like they need to make up for that maturity deficit. And so as a result, we see that Rory is the typical people-pleasing perfectionist. Rory is the perfect student. She doesn't cause problems. She is well-behaved in general. She wants people to like her, and she is in some ways bought into this image of herself as the perfect daughter, the perfect friend, the perfect student, like everything like that. This is a result of her upbringing. It probably also, to some extent, was her way of coping with their difficult situation when she was younger, because she didn't want to create any more problems for her mother. And so she felt in some ways obligated to be so perfect. The other thing to understand about Rory is that she is very codependent with her mother. So her and her mother have this seemingly great relationship where they're almost more like friends and sisters than mother and daughter, and that's often portrayed as if it's meant to be a good thing. The problem with that is that it seems like Rory has really lacked in a parental figure in her life. So while it may seem like she's perfect and well behaved, and therefore, you think, oh, well, Lorelai did something right, and in a lot of ways, she did a lot of good things as a mother. When problems arise, and we will see this as I go through all of her relationships, her reaction is often really negative and, in a way, very immature and clearly somebody who didn't have a parental authority figure. You even see it when Lorelai herself tries to play, as she calls it, the mother card, right at the beginning of the series. So in a way, Rory has been spoiled in that sense, because if you can imagine it, if you have, let's say, a best friend, and then one day your best friend gets upset with you and you're grounded, that would feel a little bit weird and a little bit jarring. And so this is the difficulty that happens when you blur the lines between parent and child and friends. And finally, the last thing that I want you to understand about Rory as a character for the purposes of these videos is that she is somebody who ends up being torn between two worlds. This is alluded to in her valedictorian speech when she graduates from high school. And in that speech, she's talking about the world of books and then her real world, but in reality, as a character, she is pulled between the world of her mother as a single mom, making it in the world on her own. They didn't have a lot of financial privileges, although the finances in this show are a whole other topic. And on the other hand, she has her grandparents' world, the world that she eventually starts to move closer and closer towards as she goes to Yale and as that part of the story progresses. And this becomes a little bit of a conflict for her in her relationships, because that is the world of wealth, privilege, and entitlement. And so Rory kind of inhabits both of these worlds, and sometimes I think she almost doesn't even know where she fits in. She is also somebody who has significant ambitions in her life, ambitions that we see right from the beginning, again, to go to Harvard, to become some type of journalist, foreign correspondent, go out there, see the world, do big things, do important things. That's Rory in a nutshell. Now, for Dean's part, he is the small town boy, or suburban boy, I would say, because he came from Chicago, but it seems very much like the image you get is that the family was a very suburban family, 2 parents, 2 kids, and a white picket fence. The beginning of their relationship starts out like any good teen drama. Boy meets girl, boy likes girl, boy tells girl that he likes her, girl returns the affections, they kiss at Dosie's Market.
I got kissed, and I shoplifted.
All very sweet. What is clear from the beginning of the relationship is that Dean is very much besotted with Rory. He says to her something like, "I've been watching you, but not in a creepy way." Although I'm not really sure how you can watch someone in a non-creepy way, but I digress. The point is, he clearly has seen her, and right from the beginning, I guess you would call it love at first sight, which we know can be problematic because it means that Dean has projected a lot of his own sort of views on Rory onto her before he even really knew anything about her. It's like he saw her as the sweet, quiet, well-behaved, bookish, potentially socially awkward girl. And he just filled in the blanks from there. Let's fast forward to the 3-month anniversary, because this is the first time that we really start to see the cracks emerge. So the 3-month anniversary rolls around. Dean wants to do something special for Rory, and he plans this really elaborate evening, and it's very sweet and beautiful, and they have a great time. And the whole thing culminates with him taking her to some junkyard, I guess, where he shows her this half put together car, and tells her that this is a car that he is building for her, which is so sweet. And then he tops it all off by telling her that he loves her. And she panics, she freezes up, she doesn't know how to respond. Because the truth is, Rory is not in love with Dean. Not that way, not yet, arguably, potentially not ever. Dean then reacts really angrily. He gets upset about the fact that Rory does not return his feelings and then immediately breaks up with her, and that's the end of that. On the one hand, I can understand where Dean is coming from. He feels hurt. He's really laid all his feelings out on the table and feels as though, Rory has not reciprocated, and that can be really painful. And as a teenager, of course, his reaction is totally normal, but understand that on the flip side, what this is another manifestation of the dark side of being a nice guy. And this is a theme that came up a little bit in the Luke and Lorelai episode as well. If you didn't see it, I'll put a card up here. But what I mean when I say the dark side of a nice guy is that when the nice guy is doing nice things for a woman that he fancies, let's say, that's all well and good, up until the point where the woman does not reciprocate his feelings. And then he tends to lash out in anger. And any woman who deals with men will have at least one, if not multiple, stories about these types of situations. You see, the nice guy's MO is to do nice things to create a sense of obligation, so that you feel like you owe him your love, your affection, your attention, all of that, because he's such a nice guy. And this is a little bit the dynamic that we will see in Rory and Dean's relationship. Because as I said, Rory didn't love him. She clearly liked him. She clearly enjoyed his attentions, his affections. She had a crush on him. She found him attractive, whatever. But her feelings never really progressed to love. And that's okay. Rory is allowed to feel that way. She is allowed to not love this guy, even though he's perfect on paper, even though he treats her amazingly, even though he does all the right things. She is entitled to feel how she feels. And this is the beginning of the problems. Because again, remember, Rory is a people pleaser. So she is much more likely to end up falling prey to that sense of obligation, that sense of like, oh, he's such a nice guy, I should love him. What is wrong with me that I don't love him? It must be something broken inside of me. And you can see that she tries to justify it because of her mother and her upbringing and this, that, and the other. The truth is, the feelings just weren't there, and that's okay. But as a consummate people pleaser, it's like, no, she really should love him. And I think from this point on, she's going to spend the rest of the relationship basically trying to talk herself into loving him, because that is what she should do. That is what everybody expects her to do. Her mom likes Dean, which is another thing to keep in mind. Because again, she and her mom have this codependent relationship. Even Dean picks up on it in the episode about Donna Reed, where they were watching that show, and then Rory was talking about problematic portrayal of women in that show and in that era. And Dean just says to her, you only feel that way because your mom feels that way. He was actually fairly astute to this sort of dynamic between them. I mean, you can't blame him. The first date they had was initiated by Lorelai inviting him over to movie night, and she was there. So he has had a front row seat about their sort of codependent relationship, and in particular, Rory's tendency to align herself with her mother and whatever it is that her mother thinks about any particular topic. I mean, to be honest, the clues are right there in the show's theme song. Where you lead, I will follow. To me, that's a little bit the dynamic between Lorelai and Rory. Rory follows her mom's lead in almost all things. So yes, that's the first problem in their relationship. Dean's love for Rory far exceeds Rory's feelings for him. And yet Rory is not able to acknowledge this about herself and accept that she simply doesn't love this man, or this boy, actually, I know. But she will continue to hold on to this relationship because her mom likes him, everybody else likes him, everybody thinks they're the perfect couple. She's a people pleaser. She wants to, again, embody this image of like the perfect girl, the perfect student, the perfect daughter. So she will drag this relationship out much longer than she really should have. And in the end, she ends up hurting herself and Dean way more than she would have done if she had just accepted that she doesn't feel that way about him. And that's okay. So coming back to their relationship, after the breakup, there's a bit of time where they're not together and they end up getting back together because Rory seemingly acknowledges that she still has feelings for Dean and tells Dean that she loves him. And so they have this sort of reunion. Yay, everyone's happy. As I said, from this point on, the cracks emerge. The first thing you will notice is that although Rory tells Dean that she loves him, there are multiple occasions where you can see that she isn't so invested in the relationship, not as much as him. And there are many allusions to that. For example, Lorelai refers to him as the boy who hangs out in the trees, suggesting that he constantly seems to be there, skulking in the background, watching her. Again, apparently he doesn't watch her in a creepy way. There's another episode where Rory's talking about how many times Dean has called her or paged her. He's very persistent in his pursuit of her and his hanging on to her. And part of that is really his reaction to the feelings that he has that Rory doesn't really love him. And so he feels insecure in this relationship. This also fosters a lot of jealousy. So Dean has a lot of jealousy throughout their entire relationship, particularly from the 3-month breakup to the reunion moving forward. The first time we see that is with Tristan. Tristan is a boy that Rory goes to school with. He also has expressed interest in Rory, but Rory has never returned his feelings, and good for her because Tristan was a bit of a creep. However, this does not stop Dean being jealous of Tristan, and it creates multiple problems between them. One particular instance was when Rory had to do a school project and Tristan was in her group. They were doing a scene from Romeo and Juliet, obviously. Dean was hovering around, skulking in the background, as he does, watching her, but not in a creepy way. And Tristan was playing up to try to make Dean more jealous because he could. Again, Tristan's a creep. But the point is, Rory did not do anything wrong, and yet it still created conflict between her and Dean. Almost as though Dean was trying to punish her for the fact that Tristan liked her, when she had no control over that, and she had at all times been clear that she didn't like him back. But Dean couldn't take her word for that, and part of the reason was because internally he felt that her feelings were just not there. Like she was not in this relationship as much as he was. But the jealousy really comes to a head when we meet Jess. And I will talk more about Jess in another video, obviously. So look forward to that. Talk about how Dean was jealous of Jess right from the beginning. Before we even really got an inkling that Rory was interested in Jess, because it seemed like Jess was interested in Rory. In all of the initial sort of Jess phases, let's say, Rory wasn't really doing anything to attract his attention. And of course, this triggered Dean's jealousy. And there were multiple times where they had conflicts that, in my opinion, were really unwarranted. For example, when Rory wanted to have an evening to herself and not spend time with Dean, first of all, he was a little bit put off by it. Then he ended up coming over to her house anyway. And then he was upset that she actually had other people over, one of whom was Jess, which made it all the worse in his eyes. But the other one was Paris. Of course, in hindsight, you can kind of understand why he was jealous. But at the time, Rory had not done anything wrong. Rory is allowed to want to spend time with other people who are not Dean. But either way, that particular episode really shows us that Rory is aware that Dean doesn't like Jess, Dean is jealous of Jess and that it causes conflicts between her and Dean. The fact that he is jealous of Jess and she is therefore conscientious about even being seen talking to him or spending time with him, which isn't actually a very healthy dynamic. In some ways, as Dean becomes more and more jealous, and as this relationship sort of starts to unravel, we see that Dean almost stops viewing Rory as a partner and really starts to view her as a prize to be won. And the best example of this is that basket bidding episode. It is a bit like the basket represents Rory, and Dean and Jess are both bidding for her, emphasizing that she is a prize for them to fight over. And when Jess wins the basket, Dean becomes angry with Rory, even though she had no control over what Jess would do. Now, in that scenario, of course, Rory was not blameless because she then went and had lunch with Jess and then spent time with him one-on-one, which, knowing that Dean is jealous of this, was probably insensitive. But at the same time, why shouldn't she be able to spend time with another person without her boyfriend becoming angry and jealous and possessive? And this is where the problem really culminates. Dean becomes increasingly possessive and territorial of Rory, and it's sometimes couched as like, oh, he's just being protective of her because that Jess is problematic. And he is problematic. But Rory is not a child that needs protecting, or at least she's not his child. So that's not a healthy dynamic for a relationship between peers. But of course, Dean continues to hold on to this relationship because, again, he views Rory as a prize to be won, and as long as she's his girlfriend, he has won. And this is despite obviously starting to see that Rory is actually starting to return the feelings for Jess. And it's that people-pleasing dynamic on Rory's end and Dean's sort of territorial, wanting to win and seeing Rory as the prize on his end that ends up dragging their relationship out way too long. Even after Jess crashes the car that he built for her, even after like everything that happened, it takes him so long to get to the point where he can acknowledge that this thing between Rory and Jess is going on. And Rory on her end is not able to acknowledge that and realize that she doesn't have feelings for Dean, not really. You know, Lorelai even tries to call her out on it after she spends that summer in DC and she comes back and she's all, you know, why is Jess over there making out with some other girl? Even Lorelai, the cool BFF mom, is like, what are you doing? You're not being fair to Dean. You're treating him badly by having interest in another man and not acknowledging it and like keeping him, like dragging him along. And of course, because of their relationship, Rory reacts very badly to this. She doesn't accept criticism from her mom well. But it also reminds her again that her mom likes Dean and her mom does not like Jess. And as I said, Rory's very codependent on her mom and she will follow her mom's lead. And so this seems to redirect her attention back to Dean, but again, it's like she is intellectually trying to talk herself into being in a relationship with him, and that never works. And Dean finally ends the relationship with her in a particularly public and slightly embarrassing way, but never mind, I completely understand why he did it. So Dean ends the relationship, but by the way, in their entire relationship, Dean is always the one who's ending the relationship with Rory, and he's always the one who's ending it with her because he's coming to the realization that Rory just isn't in it. But it always has to be him who ends the relationship. So let's fast forward then in time, because we're going to skip over obviously everything that happens with Jess. That's a topic for another video. And we're coming to Dean and Rory 2.0. So Rory goes off to Yale, Dean marries his high school girlfriend Lindsay, and everything seems to be going smoothly, sort of. It seems like, despite Lindsay being a perfect match for Dean on paper, but unfortunately, Dean is still hung up on Rory. Rory, the girl who got away. So he can't seem to get Rory off his mind, and unfortunately, they reconnect when Dean is working on Lorelai's inn, the Dragonfly Inn, when she's renovating it. And they seem to start to reconnect, spend time together, realize, I guess, that there's still some sort of spark. Dean, in the meantime, is unhappy in his marriage, kind of, although I wonder to what extent his unhappiness in his marriage was really based on the fact that he was still in love with Rory, in some ways almost mirroring the dynamic that he and Rory had, where he was a lot more in love with Rory than Rory was with him, thus seeding doubt and insecurity in him. I wonder to what extent Lindsay felt the same way, where she was in love with Dean and invested in this relationship way more than Dean was in love with her, and this formed problems for them. So that imbalance in people's sort of love and commitment to a relationship will always create problems. Dean does the typical thing. I hate to say it, but he does play the typical affair line. Things are over with my wife. He tells Rory that he's unhappy in his relationship, that their marriage is over, and they end up in bed together. You know, it was a little bit of a D move, let's say. Because, of course, in the next scene, we see that Lindsay does not really believe that their marriage is over, and that Rory is now the other woman, something that she actually has difficulty acknowledging. And once again, we see this dynamic where Lorelai confronts Rory about her behavior. Rory reacts very badly to the criticism from her mother because, again, the whole mother-best friend thing makes that dynamic difficult when Lorelai tries to be the actual mother, the actual sort of responsible figure. Rory rejects that dynamic. And in this case, she does what she will do in future again, which is to essentially shut down, cut her mother out, and then run off to Europe with her grandmother. And then she doesn't talk to her mother or barely talks to her for weeks, I guess. I don't know how long they're in Europe. Doesn't matter. The whole trip, she basically ices her mother out because her mother tried to confront her and call her out about her behavior, as if she had no right to tell Rory that, hey, what are you doing sleeping with a married man? In the meantime, we see that Dean and Lindsay didn't break up. So Dean had this affair with Rory. Rory ran off to Europe. Dean did not break up with Lindsay. D move number 2. He was dragging Lindsay along, almost like the way that Rory dragged him along. Interesting that. He learned nothing from being on the other end of that, clearly, and has done the same thing to Lindsay. And then in the end, they break up only when Lindsay finds out about the affair through this letter that Rory writes him. Another typical married man having an affair move. He was so stereotypical in that way. Married men almost never leave the wife unless and until they're forced to because the wife finds out about the affair. But maybe that is also a topic for another video. The point is, Lindsay and Dean do end up breaking up as a direct result of the affair that he and Rory have, and then he and Rory start sort of dating again. But once again, we start to see the problems in their relationship reemerge. And to some extent, I wonder, again, if Rory's people-pleasing tendencies led her to continue to date Dean in circumstances where she kind of felt bad and responsible, at least in part, for the breakdown of his marriage. And so it's almost like she should probably give it another try so that it wasn't all for naught. And this brings us to the final phase of their relationship. And I've left this particular dynamic of their relationship to the end. Although it was there from the beginning, it wasn't as relevant because they were younger and they were still in high school. And that is their difference in class and education. The final straw if you will. Because way back in the beginning of their relationship, we did see this alluded to. When Dean meets her grandparents, for example, her grandfather is asking Dean about his future plans, which are wishy-washy at best. We see that Rory encourages Dean to go to college, and he does enroll, but then he drops out, ostensibly because of Lindsay, but I don't buy that because he never re-enrolls, even after their relationship is over and even after he's dating Rory, who is herself studying at Yale. So what was stopping him from going back to college then? He was living at his parents' place. To me, the Lindsay marriage thing was an excuse. I don't think Dean liked going to college. I don't think it was really what he wanted. And in the end, he does not pursue higher education, which is fine, okay? I don't think that everybody needs to go to college or that it's the only way to have a good job or a good career. But understand that Rory is highly intellectual. And one of the things that you will see that initially attracted her to Jess was their shared intellectual compatibility and the way that they connected on literature and music and things like that. So for her and Dean to not have those things in common was a problem in their relationship that became obvious as they were getting older and as Rory was now pursuing her higher education. Because, for example, she gives Dean an article that she wrote for the Yale Daily News about the Life and Death Brigade, and she asks Dean for his opinion, and all he gives her is like, yeah, it's good. I enjoyed reading it. He doesn't have anything deeper to say about it. It also becomes clear that this whole idea of Rory being between two worlds is becoming more and more obvious. As she is going into Yale and as she is spending more time in that world, she is starting to connect more with the side of her that is a Gilmore, that is somebody from wealth and privilege. And we will see it later in the Logan years, but it is starting here. And in the end, what happens is that her grandparents throw her a male Yale party, which, I mean, hats off to Richard and Emily for that. I was like, they do horrible things, but I can't hate them. Because in the end, they were right. Like, they were right that Dean wasn't the right guy for her. He was not on her level. And so they wanted to introduce her to all of these other potential suitors. And the way they go about it, though, like throwing her this party with only other boys from Yale. Anyway, so yeah, so classic Richard and Emily move, getting involved and trying to manipulate the situation. And in the end, Dean is coming to pick her up from the party and sees her in a tiara surrounded by all of these guys. And I think two things really probably played into this last sort of moment / breakup. One is the realization that Dean was always going to have competition when it came to Rory, and I don't think that he could deal with that. Rory was beautiful, she was intelligent, and she clearly caught the attention of many other men, and he had this insecurity and jealousy around that right from the beginning. And once again, we see it here where, you know, she's got like Logan and his gang and they've all been partying, and Dean just realizes like he can't keep trying to compete for her attention and her affections in that way. And then the second is the class distinctions that once again Dean realizes, you know, he's a college dropout with no real prospects for the future, and here she is in a mansion with diamonds surrounded by a bunch of guys from similarly wealthy and well-educated backgrounds who have basically the world is their oyster type of a future. They will be the future CEOs, entrepreneurs, and the 1%. And this is the world that Rory kind of feels drawn to in some ways. Like, again, she is pulled between these worlds. And so Dean realizes like he doesn't belong in that world. There isn't room for him in Rory's world anymore. And he ends the relationship there and then, and that's the final break. But as you can see, it's always Dean who has to break up with Rory. Rory wasn't really ever going to break up with him, I think. And it's kind of scary in a way to think like, how long would she have let this relationship go on? And in some ways, her reluctance to really acknowledge her own feelings or lack thereof for Dean, and the fact that they really weren't necessarily a great match, at least not in a long-term future sense, probably actually hurt Dean a lot more than she really needed to. If she had just been willing to be the bad guy in some ways, right from the beginning, and just acknowledge that, you know, Dean's a really attractive guy and he treats her amazingly, but he isn't the guy that she really loves. And if she had been able to just acknowledge that, break things off with him then, and not go back. And Dean also needed to recognize that Rory was not a prize to be won, that her heart wasn't in it, and that there really wasn't anything that he could do to make her love him. So that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of Rory and Dean's relationship. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and make sure that if you are subscribed so you don't miss the Rory Jess and Rory Logan episodes coming up soon. And as I said, if you haven't seen the other Gilmore Girl episodes, the playlist is linked below, and I will try to put one of the videos over here. And I hope to see you in the next video.